See what, okay?
Just a keeping of the theme, the bike I'll talk about tonight is a 1928 Scott Flying Squirrel. For 99% of you in the room, you've been in my basement, you know that's where it is right now. Last time we actually rode the bike was in the 90s. The theme of tonight, or this night, all night, Dennis has been here, and the cool part about Dennis's presentation, the bike rides up, there it is in the parking lot. It can be that, it can be a bike you used to own, it can be a bike you want to own, but it's all, if it's a bike you do own, that's even better. But there are no real ground rules for the restoration presentations. So what I'm going to tell you about is Bert Bentley was one of our charter members. He was born in 1909, and we have the write-up in the webpage. He was a guy some of us visited when we were young guys, because he was restoring teens and 20s and 30s bikes 50 years ago when other people weren't doing it. His flagship bike, the very last bike he parted with, was the Scott Flying Squirrel. He spent 5 years over in England during World War II, and he loved British motorcycles, and he loved Harleys as well. He raced Harleys and hill climbed Harleys, but he had a passion for British bikes. This Scott Flying Squirrel was always around Manitoba by reputation. It's a 28 600cc, it's a two-stroke, they're water-cooled. Alfred Scott was born in the 1870s. He had a patent for an internal combustion engine in 1893, but he didn't start building motorcycles till around 1907, 1908, and they made Scott motorcycles in England right up to about 1970. It was a very high revving engine. The RPMs could go very high. They were very successful on the racetrack. They were water cooled. They had a radiator in 1907, 1908, right through on every one of their models. So the Gold Wings of 75 is really like so many old motorcycles, is old technology just revisited and brought up to a higher standard with newer parts. This bike came through Toronto dealership in 1928 and came out to Manitoba for the sole purpose of being raced on the circuit at the track in Headingley, the track on Sturgeon, and also went down through North Dakota, Minnesota, in that area. It was completely stripped down right from the get-go, and it was a dirt track racer. In 1939, and coming in races in the Brandon area, it blew up, and it was left in a blacksmith shop in and around Shiloh, Manitoba, in that little town of little Scottish name, not McDonald.
Alexander.
No,
Alexander.
Not Alexander. Douglas. Thank you. In the little town of Douglas, there was a blacksmith shop. Bentley comes back from World War II, restores about 20 motorcycles, 11 Harleys, 12 Harleys, 15 Harleys, Clevelands. His newest bike was a 30 Henderson 4. They were all restored in these little 10 by 10 sheds in his backyard on Winchester Street in St. James. And I used to go over there in the 70s and just awe and Google at all these bikes in his sheds. But he heard about this Scott, and he started tracking it down. He finally found out in around 1963, that the bike that did all the racing never got out of that Shiloh area, and he found the bike and he bought it. So from about 63 till the 70s, he restored what he had of the bike, stripped down as a racer. He was at a garage sale in the 70s, and if you go down in my basement, you'll see that the big racing knee pads, they were on the bike, and the flat Scott tanks racing ones, the stock ones, were on a shelf at a garage sale in St. Charles, on St. Charles Street, and Bert said, hey, those look like Scott knee pads from a Squirrel, like from a Scott motorcycle. And the guy said, well, yeah, I used to race one in the 30s. And he said, you're such and such. He says, yeah. Downstairs, he says, but I saved the stuff I stripped off it in 29, in that era. So if you go downstairs and you look at the bike in my basement, the speedometer, the carrier, the chain guard, the fenders, all that stuff had never ever been on the bike. It was always in a box. So a lot of that stuff got put back together. There was still some of the bike missing because it had engine parts and things had been changed over because it had been raced. In '77, Ziggy we were a new club. Bert had joined. Unfortunately, he had sold all his motorcycles off. He still had his Scott, and he restored a few other little small bore bikes, but he was a member, and we put a display on with a big car show at the convention center at 77. John, you probably were there. Ziggy had an Indian in there, and I had my 13 Indian in there. And a guy walked up to Burt Bentley and said, I know that bike. His name is Toby Wilson. He says, I used to do the tuning on that engine. And the other missing parts were at Toby Wilson's house.
Wow.
So Burt finished the bike in 1978. As fate would have it, the bike was all finished completely in 78. Went down to Davenport, Iowa that year. I think Ziggy went down with him in the car, and it won the most unique bike because it's, you know, Americans weren't sure what to make of a water-cooled bike. So fast track to our rally that we have here in 1991, and Bert's getting to be into his 80s. He rode on that rally that year in 91. He was 80 some odd years old, and I said I always had the right of first refusal on the bike. So the last bike he sold was to me, and he sold me the Scott Flying Squirrel. And this picture was taken a year later, which would have been 1999. Bert was 90, and he'd had this big 90th birthday party. And his grandson from California, who was a fine art student, made the Burt Bentley trophy, which we presented at that first. We had a swap meet and a judge meet for our club at the Tin Lizzie Car Museum in St. Francis Xavier. This is a picture at St. Francis Xavier. It also ended up in the Antique Motorcycle Club of America magazine in 1999. I think it's Miss June or Miss July. I can't remember. July. I mean, rather not Miss July. July. And this was the picture that Rick Shunk took, who some of us remember from the rally last year, was here on the Vincent. Rick was the editor for the Antique Motorcycle magazine. This was the picture he took at St. Francis. Well, that year, Bert handed out the best restored bike for the second year in '99. So we've been giving out that Bentley trophy since the late '90s. And of course, the most recent winner is Dennis Woods in the rally. So it's interesting that, you know, you can buy and sell bikes. I've restored bikes from every nut and bolt, and I've bought bikes. This is the easy way of buying it, but there's that old adage that I've had this bike for over 20 years, and certainly this will always be Burt Bentley's Scott in my mind. The fact is, for a lot of these bikes, we're caretakers. You know, Dave's got the bike from Daytona, the 1 in 52, and as long as Dave's got it, it's Dave's bike. Somebody's going to have that bike after. So, that's another unique part about the club and what we do, is we're actually, in a way, we're preserving historical artifacts now. I mean, I got enough stuff running right now, but it is eventually in retirement, that's got to come out of the basement and got to get ridden, because it's a 600cc bike and it can go all day, and there's no reason why it shouldn't be out on the road. So that'll be a challenge for me down the road. So that's the Scott Flying Squirrel, water-cooled two-stroke. Not many around in North America, but certainly in England. There's a huge following, and they're called the Yowling, and they have a huge club, and they're like the Vincent Owners Club. They reproduce spares, and they're almost a cult-like group. The Scott people love Scots, and some of them are like diehard. They don't even own anything else. Granny.
Question, is that a single cylinder or a twin?
It's a twin.
Twin.
Yeah. So, that's the end of that.
Very good.